Hi, Sally. Thanks for agreeing to speak with me about Tearfund. If you can tell us a bit about yourself and your background, and what is your role with Tearfund?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. My name's Sally Jones-Evans. I'm one of the trustees on the board of Tearfund, actually. But a little bit of background. I had a 30-year career in banking, which came to an end with redundancy a few years ago. And I was able to take a few months off. And I decided I would have the gap year in my 40s that I'd never had when I was 18, because they weren't a thing back then. And one of the things I did in my career break was to go overseas with Tearfund. I felt really convicted that God wanted to use that time, that breathing space in my life, to really challenge me about other things. I wanted to see some of the poverty I had read and heard about, and understand how things worked in a bit more detail. And it was a life-changing few months. It would be fair to say. So I came back from that trip really convinced that I needed to try and use my business experience to try and help in some kind of way this bigger global challenge of poverty and injustice. And so I signed up to do a master's degree in international development through a distance learning college. And then I started progressively looking for work, paid or unpaid. I wasn't really worried about that. That would help me to use those business skills and use that newfound knowledge in some kind of way. And as well as joining the departmental board for the government's Department for International Development for a few years, which I've since stood down from, I joined Tearfund. And it was lovely to come back to the organisation that had first seeded that kind of enthusiasm in me, if you like. And I've got some very special memories of those first couple of visits to Tanzania that I did, but since then I've been abroad also to Rwanda and to Nepal with Tearfund.
Wonderful. I went with Tearfund to Tanzania in 2019. So that's something we have in common there. So for those who don't know much about Tearfund, if you could tell us who Tearfund is, what it does, who it supports, and how your services make a difference to their lives.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing is to say that it's a proudly evangelical Christian organisation. It's basically a humanitarian aid agency and a long-term development agency. And we're absolutely committed to working to relieve and eradicate poverty and injustice across the world. We're a UK registered charity. We work in over 50 countries on pretty much every continent. And the really unique thing about Tearfund's operating model is that we work through the local church. So we see our primary role helping to support and equip local churches, local Christians, to work within their communities to help people lift themselves out of poverty in a really sustainable way. So where perhaps other agencies might employ professional development people to go and do development, we work very, very closely in local communities and very overtly through the church. And why do we do that? Well, we do it because we believe strongly in so many passages in the Bible, but for instance, because Jesus came to bring life in all its fullness, and that means to all people. And we believe that every Christian has got a part to play in bringing this hope to the world wherever they are. Now, I spent a little bit of time looking at St. Mildred's website before today, and I could see that, you do lots of work in your community, and especially through COVID, you've done an awful lot of stuff to pivot towards the needs of your community, etc. And clearly, churches everywhere in Africa, in Asia, in South America, etc., are also trying to do this. And so we seek to be a resource to those, to help them to reach out and to be salt and light in their communities, and to help long-term sustainable development in those places that suffer from poverty and injustice. And it's interesting that because we do things that way, what we see is that the impact of our money is multiplied many, many times over, like the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So, we are perhaps giving training or sometimes giving grants, but often giving skills to churches that then reach out through their local voluntary work to reach hundreds, thousands of people in their communities. And so the money that our supporters donate goes an incredibly long way compared with if we were just paying engineers or professional salaries to go and work out in the kind of development field, if you like.
Mm,
One
mm,
extra point just to draw out is that because the church tends to have been there a long time and plans to stay there for a long time, we're often the first into a situation before some devastating event occurs, and we often stay long, long after other people leave as well. And so it's a very sustainable model of trying to do development and to help people really lift themselves out of poverty with great dignity in a very sustainable way.
mm, mm. That's great. I like the the idea of empowering those who are already in their communities to support those communities. That's a really key thing, really.
Mm.
Okay. And so what has been the impact of COVID? Obviously, COVID-19 has had a massive impact globally, and no doubt would have affected some of the countries in which you operate in. If you can tell us a bit of how you have managed to cope with this and what impact it's had on the people you support.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Edna. I mean, firstly, let me say that, we absolutely lament the incredible distress that this pandemic has caused across the world. In the UK, we've grown used, haven't we, to watching the news with daily death statistics. And, in so many countries that Tearfund works in, we work in over 50 countries in all, they have no NHS, they have no option to create furlough schemes, they don't pay universal credit benefits. And the problems, even though they feel really painful in the UK, are sometimes magnified in such a painful way all around the world. And we, through our partners, heard that cry very early on from some of those that we serve, that as well as a health pandemic, that was causing real fear, that people were starting to just worry they were going to starve before they would die of COVID, quite honestly, because the consequence of internal trade and border shutdowns, the global economic shutdown, the understandable tendency for Western and Northern governments to prioritise their own citizens first, just meant that there was a real threat that decades of development progress was going to risk being reversed. And so it's been a very, very tough year, and a very worrying year, but we see a lot of light at the end of that tunnel as well.
Mm.
I mean, to talk about what we've done, so I guess first up, we adapted a lot of our existing projects. So, for example, where we've perhaps got humanitarian emergency feeding centres, we had to adapt those to be COVID safe, and we reached out into lots of our existing project work to help give them information as to how to adapt. And we sometimes got there quicker than their own governments got there with information. There were parts of the world that have had, fresh crises as a result of the COVID challenge. For instance, people living in refugee centres, mass displacement camps, etc., who suddenly have a new threat, a new risk over and above. Maybe cholera was there before, but suddenly they've got COVID as well. And so we delivered emergency aid to those sorts of situations where it was needed. And then we've pivoted our work to be more relevant to this kind of COVID era. So we've got involved in constructing taps and water tanks for people for whom wash your hands was a meaningless instruction because they had no running water. And we've distributed lots of hygiene kits as well, PPE and the like, to situations that just didn't have it. And we've been very involved as well in promoting the right messages around health and hygiene, protection, social distancing, all of those things that we get thrown at us daily in the UK. We've helped to put into communities where perhaps there isn't the same respect for their political leaders. There's a lot of suspicion about government corruption, and they're not sure whether to believe what the government are telling them, or maybe the government's giving a different message completely. And so we've equipped church leaders with materials, with messages, and with strong kind of theological groundings, biblical groundings in some of these messages, to give them the chance to pass that message on. And because church pastors in so many countries in which we work are right at the heart of the community, and they reach into the furthest parts of rural, remote areas, church leaders have got respect, people listen to them. And so the carrying of those messages has been a really important part of what we've been doing over the last year, actually. And we've mobilized people to pray for an end to the suffering, or to cope through the suffering. That's such an important tool that we believe that we bring to the world, in addition to our human efforts, if you like. And now in recent months, we've also really been starting to mobilize our advocacy and our campaigning and influencing, for instance, for fair global access to vaccines, so that the northern and western economies don't stockpile unfairly supplies of vaccines, and that everyone will have fair access to them across the globe. So yeah, it's been a very tough year. We've come through it strong as an organisation with a real sense of purpose and value in what we've been doing. And we've been very encouraged that there's evidence that in some of those communities where we've been working longest and deepest to equip them to be salt and light, that actually there's some evidence that they've coped with the stretches and strains of the COVID pandemic, you know, better in some cases than some of their other neighbours. So it's given us a real sense of purpose to keep going.
Excellent, excellent. That sounds absolutely incredible. And so tell me a bit about how Tearfund shares the gospel in its work. You know, what difference has that made or had in what you do?
Well, you've probably already heard that we think it infuses everything we do, actually. There are faith-based development agencies that don't work quite so overtly and hold their Christian faith so highly, if you like. I know that you at St Mildred's have been involved in supporting some work in Nepal over previous years, and that can be quite a hostile environment, that country, to be a Christian organisation. But we strongly pray against any adverse power battle, if you like, and make sure that we still hold good to being very overtly Christian in all we do. I think, as I say, we think about our work as equipping people to be salt and light in the world and to shine Jesus' love out to those in darkness. So our job isn't directly to convert people. We think the Holy Spirit does that. But we do act very openly in Jesus' name, and we hope to draw people closer to God and to equip the local church to be very proud, practical helpers and livers out of mission in their communities, and that's what we seek to do, and so on. And so when we evaluate our development programs, we don't just measure how many people we fed or how many people we helped to lift out of poverty, but we actually have got a tool that we use to measure the growth of emotional and spiritual well-being in communities as well, and look very holistically at that sense of wellness and well-being at the same time.
Okay, thank you. And so what would you say is the difference between Tearfund's work in the UK and elsewhere in the world? So, you know, how does your campaigning on climate change, for example, relate to relieving poverty and or sharing the gospel, for that matter?
Yeah, very good question, actually, because you see a certain dimension of Tearfund in the UK, and it would be different if you were sat in a very poor part of the world. I guess we work in three ways, really. We do humanitarian aid where it's really necessary. We do long-term development work in the way that I just explained, and then we campaign and advocate for justice and to alleviate poverty. And the truth is, in the UK, we don't need to do the first bit because we don't tend to suffer humanitarian emergencies here, or if there are such things, they're more localised and other agencies work. We don't do long-term development work here because that's not where the poorest are. So we work in other countries to do that. But the third leg of what we do everywhere. We do it in those poor countries and we do it here. So in the UK, you see our campaigning and advocacy work much more clearly on things like climate change and vaccine access and that sort of thing. Whereas if you were sat in Malawi, you would see all three legs of what we're doing. So we think that that advocacy side is absolutely integral to what we do. We can't work to do long-term development unless we also work to tackle the root causes of poverty and injustice. And we can be so much more effective if we get policies and processes aligned to tackle those things. And if we stand up against things that are unfair and institutionally likely to perpetuate poverty. So we do feel very strongly that it's an important part of what we do in campaigning against those root causes. And, you know, you asked specifically about climate change. And I think it's widely recognised now that as the planet warms, the poorest will suffer the most. And there's a real risk that decades of development progress could actually be reversed. And this can be, for instance, because those who are reliant on subsistence agriculture can have their whole lives devastated and their livelihoods threatened when a harvest fails. Whereas if there's a blip in a climate event in one part of the world, we just might notice that the prices go up a bit at the supermarket, or that our our flowers are sourced from Tanzania instead of Kenya because there's been a blight in one country versus another. So in other countries, it's life-threatening when these climate events happen, or when the planet warms and rainfall patterns change and harvests start to change. And also lots of these poor countries have fundamentally got very weak economies that aren't very diversified. They depend on fewer industries. So we really do need to help to campaign for an equal distribution of wealth and wealth creation, if you like, across the world, so that people aren't as vulnerable as they are in the moment. But we do see lots of progress coming through, and we kind of maintain a register of successes and that come about as a result of that campaigning. I mean, Malawi is very widely reported, banned use of plastic bags over there, which has kind of really stepped out and done something very strongly, very effectively, that we've been trying to do in the UK and elsewhere. In Nepal, which again, I know St Mildred's is close to the church in that country in some respects because of your previous support, there's a lot of campaigning done around the injustices of modern slavery and people trafficking. Of young boys to go work on Middle Eastern building sites, and of young girls into the sex trade in India and elsewhere. So we really do see some power battles start to shift when we work together. But we believe very strongly that what we can do in the UK is join in that voice and amplify that voice. So it's not just those trapped in poverty having to advocate for their own rights and justice, but we can stand with them in a really practical way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And so you've referred to Nepal because we did support Nepal for a number of years. And so tell us about the Tearfund Connected Churches initiative, because obviously that's how we very much support yourselves as a charity. How does this initiative work, and help to explain that for us?
Yeah, so I think you did support us through that Connected Churches initiative, which is evolving actually at the moment into something that we'll probably call slightly different. So I'll come on to that in a moment. But yes, I think you partnered us, and that meant that we partnered you with the United Missions to Nepal partner that we work with, and many churches in Nepal. And interestingly, I visited their work there when I was out there a couple of years ago. And I contacted Pranaya, our Nepal country director, before today, and he sends you greetings and appreciation for all your support over the years. And he kind of let me know that that support is really appreciated. Now, in terms of shifting, what we've done is partly as a result of COVID, but also a number of other aspects of feedback. We are just reshaping how we partner with the UK church, if you like, and we probably are standing down that pairing arrangement where all of your money and your support gets directed to one place. And we envisage trying to build a new church partnership and engagement strategy in the UK that's broader. And it means that we ask you to do three things, not just to give, but to pray, to give, and to act with us. And we think this is more aligned to equipping you for integral mission as well. So just as we've got some amazing teaching material resources that we use to equip churches across Africa and Asia and elsewhere to be salt and light to their communities, we thought how crazy that we don't also make those resources available to churches in the UK if you want them. So you'll have lots more resources given to churches and to church leaders to use with their congregations and in your community work. For example, I've shared some papers recently that Tearfund has researched and had published on the theology to help answer tough questions about climate change. Or we've got some resources that we're producing and sharing on social media at the moment to help you take your youth group through a really interactive game kind of thing about climate change and so on. And so we can give resources to home groups and small groups in churches, to church leaders, to youth groups and so on, and much more information to help you to join in our advocacy campaigns, to advocate to those in power on behalf of change for the poor, if you like. We hope you will still give financially to our work. One of the things we feared about COVID is that we would see our donations drop and we'd be able to do less just at a time when there was even more needed in the world. So we hope you will still give financially, but we won't necessarily ring fence it to one partner in one country. We'll flex it to where the greatest need is, which enables us to be much more responsive to the need. And we hope really importantly and sincerely that we can also ask you to pray with us. And one of the things we'll be giving to our partnering churches is more regular prayer resources about what we see as the need and how you can best help. So yeah, pray, give, act, those three things really.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. And you're absolutely right. Giving is just one part of it. There's so much more to partnering with yourselves than the financial element. So I'm really pleased to hear that. And so really to conclude our time together, it's been so great. Tell us how we as St Mildred's Church could pray for you in Tearfund, to pray for the work that you're doing, and support you in that way.
Oh, thank you so much for asking, and we really do treasure and value your prayers. I would say, first of all, please pray for those we serve, all of us collectively together, the vulnerable, and for their protection and safety, especially at the moment, where we see the economic consequences of the global pandemic hitting incredibly hard, as well as the health consequences. So please pray for those we serve in all these parts of the world. We're finding it really hard to get the UK media's attention on some of these desperately needy places at the moment, because the UK media is dominated by UK stories right now. And so for every Christian that reaches out and thinks a bit more broadly, we're so grateful. Secondly, please do pray for income provision. The need is so great at the moment that we are concerned that despite the fact that the UK economy might contract, we really pray and hope that our income and resources will not contract, because we see the need as greater than ever. So I really would value your prayers for that, because we do rely on very loyal Christian donors and churches, individuals and churches giving regularly. We take a very small proportion of our income as a charity compared with many others from government and aid agency grants, etc., because it is about Christians giving to equip Christians to do this work. So really pray for that, and we really hope as well that some of you might be able and willing, however small an amount, to give regularly to us if that's possible. And then the third thing that's so time critical at the moment, please pray for fair access to vaccines, and for the role of the church in advocating for this. Churches in the global south and churches in countries like the UK that are close to the ear of government and close to very favourable access to vaccines, and pray that that will get out fairly right across the world.
Yeah, great, thank you. Those are very clear, and something that we will certainly be praying for over the next few months for you. Well, Sally, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I have found it really helpful, and I'm sure that we as a church will also find it really helpful in getting that much closer to the work of Tearfund, and how you are doing, working leaps and bounds in the countries that you serve. So thank you very much for that. Okay.
Thank you so much for your time, Edna, and thank you to all of your congregation for again having the chance to talk to you. Bye bye now.